Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Taking Plan Designs to New Heights. I have just a few announcements. For those of you who are requesting credit, please note that to receive CE credit, you must remain logged into the video portion of the webinar for the entire program. Logging into the audio portion only is not sufficient for CE credit. Continuing education credits are being offered for the following designations: CPE, CIMA, CPWA, CIMC, RMA, CFP, and SHRM. Also, at the end of the webinar, we would like to request that all attendees fill out the evaluation form that will pop up. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the question box. At the end of the webinar, we'll answer as many questions as we can, but we want to be respectful of your schedule and end on time. If we don't get to your question today, we will definitely follow up with you afterwards. Tomorrow, you will receive an email with a link to replay today's broadcast. So let's get started. We are joined today by Kate Blake, instructional designer and technology trainer at Pentegra. Kate has been with us since the beginning of her career, where she started in the retirement benefits field. And being the quick learner and talented contributor that she is, Kate quickly arose into various positions within Pentegra. Kate's also been able to exemplify her deep roots of industry expertise in each position that she's held, and her skills have always been the perfect complement to Pentegra's culture. So Kate, I'll turn this over to you, and you can start talking about plan design.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everybody for taking the time to join us today. And yes, plan design is one of my favorite topics to discuss. I actually hopped off of a plan design call before hopping on this webinar today, so I've got the right hat on for the job today. Some things that we'll be covering today include the importance of the plan design process. Why does it matter? Who does it matter to? And when does it matter? We'll talk about what has happened with plan design over the years. If we're talking about 401k plans, we're talking about plans that have been around since the 1970s. Certainly initially attention was paid to them, but over the years as a plan matures, plan design typically tends to fall by the wayside. So we'll explore that a little bit. We'll look at strategies to obtain and understand plan sponsor objectives. And specifically with regard to that bullet point, I'd like to share that I assume that everybody here on the call today is what I'll describe as a retirement plan partner in some fashion. And that could take a variety of roles. And I say that because that means that the perspective from which we approach these plan sponsor objectives could vary based on the role and the services that we provide. Of course, if we are an employee of the plan sponsor, an HR representative, CFO, or C-suite individual, we have our own plan objectives. We have to take that in hand with our vendors, who is our platform provider, who is our investment fiduciary, and what services are they able to provide, and any administrative nuance and considerations. So it really is important to take a holistic approach there. And then we'll lead into a discussion from there of how we can meet those objectives. So how can we use the resources from these partners, whether it be advisors, platform partners, attorneys, or other individuals, to help our plan sponsors meet these objectives. And lastly, we'll look at specific case studies of different scenarios and objectives that plan sponsors might have with regard to design, along with how we can meet them. So as we said, we'll kick off with a discussion of goals of plan design. We want to ensure that the plan achieves identified business objectives. Let's expand on that a little bit. What is an identified business objective in the perspective of the retirement plan world? Well, the most common one that I've heard in my experience are things like recruitment and retention. But depending on the nature of your business, it can be even simpler than that. You just want people to be able to have a decent amount of money later on. Or it could be much more complex. For example, if you're a business with publicly traded or even privately held stock, your business objectives there may be very different, and you may be approaching this perhaps from the perspective of a succession plan. So what are we looking to get out of this plan today versus what are we looking to get out of this plan in the future? Those two things, too, will help drive these business objectives. Secure tax advantages for the sponsor and participants. Remember, these are not just tax advantages for you as an employer, but also tax advantages for your folks. And there are opportunities here, too, particularly in the realm, from what I've seen in recent years, of some of our more complicated plans. So we know that our individual plan may have tax advantages. We know there's defined contribution plans of all stripes out there, 401ks, but more complicated ones, maybe PASOPs or ESOPs. Those all give their own tax advantages as well. Sometimes we can use plan design to streamline those tax advantages. For example, converting a 401k and a standalone ESOP together into one ESOP plan. You still get all the same tax advantages that you would with two separate plans, but only one set of fees. Again, we'll look at more examples of things along those lines, but there's a lot of ways that we can take advantage of these tax advantages for both ourselves as employers and for our plan participants. Simply to provide another source of retirement income. This is the basic motive that we discussed earlier. This falls more under the paternalistic, we can kind of get into philosophical discussions when we get into this aspect of plan design. What sort of a contribution do we want to provide to employees and why? And what sort of income will that provide to you in the future? We have all kinds of different options that we'll examine, from our defined contribution options, such as the match and non-elective contributions in varying forms, to defined contribution or even combination plans that can help us not only get retirement income, but diversify it across different streams or different plans. And lastly, of course, but certainly not leastly, perhaps most importantly, the goal of plan design helps the plan sponsor fulfill its fiduciary responsibility to participants. What I mean here is following the terms of ERISA to make sure that we're doing things like acting in the best interest of our participants, following the terms of that plan document, and things of that nature. We'll look at some examples of the importance of that as well. But the reason why it's so important for us to have this discussion today is because plan design really is a lost art. When 401ks were first, I don't want to say when they were first implemented because that's a little bit of a misnomer, but when ERISA was passed in the 1970s and 401ks gained prevalence as the preferred method of retirement saving, they took on less of the more specialized characteristics that we had seen in the past. They typically tended to be specialized types of plans that could help our highly compensated employees, bolster their retirement savings. But when they gained applicability in the mainstream, they lost that specialization. Now, I think that the reasons for that are actually really noble, which we can see in the second bullet point here that says safe harbor designs get media attention. The reason, or I should say one of the reasons why I think plan design has fallen by the wayside in favor of things like safe harbor arrangements, we'll explain that in just a minute if you're unsure, is because a lot of our plan participants are not well versed in retirement plan philosophy, maximization, and things of that nature. As a result, us as employers and retirement plan partners have wanted to make plans easier to understand for employees. And that's why I said I think that the fact that plan design is a lost art is kind of for a noble reason. It's because we want people to understand this stuff. But that being said, if we only familiarize ourselves with those basic plan options, like a basic 401k match, and that's it in our 401k plan, I do believe we're doing our employees a little bit of a disservice, because a lot of these basic formulas overlook the flexibility of modern plan document options and modern economic conditions. For example, as interest rates rise, things like cash balance plans or combo plans, as we mentioned earlier, may gain in popularity, and our traditional safe harbor designs don't really easily provide for those types of things. It's also a lost art because pre-approved plans can satisfy most sponsors' needs and objectives. Now, that's not to say that pre-approved plans are only cookie cutter. We'll look at some examples here. Pre-approved plans, and we use them here at Pentegra, can actually contain a wide array of different plan design features and options. the key is to understand them. Now, I don't know if anybody on this call works with any pre-approved plans, but the one that we have here at Pentegra, and I think I have a slide for this. Well, it's in a couple of moments. The one here we have here at Pentegra is quite large, and it has several pieces that are part of it that we'll talk about in just a moment. So I think that's another reason why we tend to get lost in this discussion, because these documents tend to be very long and onerous. So we'll try to break down today some of the key provisions that trip people up on those documents, that keep people from really embracing these proactive plan design options. So that is all driven from a perspective, I would say, of changing market conditions and changing economics. Most employers are no longer offering pension plans. So, as we said, we need to make these plans streamlined and easy for people to understand so that they can be used by the masses in a way that actually works for them. But that's just one side of the equation. Another reason why plan design has fallen down the wayside has to do with the evolution of retirement plan providers. And this is certainly not a comment on any specific provider, but in general, the nature of the retirement plan industry does tend to be margin driven. And there does tend to be a lot of opportunity for automation. I think automation can be a fantastic thing when it comes to plan design. For example, automation leads to great progressive plan design features like automatic enrollment. But automation can also lead to kind of as we said earlier, a simplification of plan provisions and our understanding of these documents. I'll give you an example. That pre-approved document that I was talking about before, and specifically the one we have at Pentegra, and I said it's got a bunch of different parts of it. It's got an adoption agreement, which is where we specify the provisions that we want to use as an employer, but it's also got a summary of plan provisions. And this is provided by our document vendor automatically. And this is another situation where, this is all happening with noble intentions. We get this great summary of the plan provisions that distills this 47-page pre-approved adoption agreement down into a really handy, like 1 or 2 page summary of all the key points of the document. And when I meet with plan sponsors, I typically ask, would you like to review the full adoption agreement, or would you like to review the summary document? And almost always they say, I do not want to review, I don't have time to look at this 47-page document. Let's review the summary, checklist. So that's what we're saying, what we're meaning when we say here, more checklist driven with fewer options. Our vendor, to use this specific example, provides the checklist to be helpful, concise, easy reference. But if we only rely on the checklist and don't explore the different world of possibilities out there, we're doing ourselves, again, a disservice. Also, it's easy for platform providers and third-party administrators to offer certain types of plans. Now, this is not the only reason we encourage them. We'll talk more, as we said, about safe harbor plans later, but they are less work to administer because they follow certain standardized provisions. As a result, it's become the default plan design. And as a result of that, it's kind of made these plan design specialists hard to find. But what that means for us and everybody on the call today, whether you're a plan sponsor, a consultant to a plan, an attorney, an advisor, this is an opportunity because we exist in these landscapes where these noble intentions have morphed into perhaps an oversimplification of, our usage of the provisions available. There's an opportunity for us as plan partners then to come in and review these documents to make sure that they're meeting our needs, because for many employers, that's not happening. So let's talk about that for a couple of minutes. When we review these documents, we want to make sure that the plan meets the goals and objectives. We talked about that. We'll look at that in more detail again in just a moment. And this results in increased support for the plan. If the plan is not meeting our needs, it is likely not going to be well utilized. And what happens when a plan is not well utilized? Well, for one, it can lead to failures in non-discrimination testing. If your non-highly compensated employees aren't contributing enough because they don't like the plan design, are you making them wait too long to enter the plan and they forget about it? And then that's having the ripple effect of limiting HCE contributions because you're failing the testing. You can see how plan design is tied in then to all these things in the entire life cycle of the plan, just like dominoes. So we come to our first poll question. We talked about pre-approved plans several times. So pre-approved plans are flexible and can satisfy most sponsors' needs and objectives. You should have a poll populating on your screen right now, which you can answer either true or false.
The poll will be open for about another more 20 seconds or so for anyone who hasn't submitted an answer. The poll is now closed, and the correct answer was A, true. Kate, you may continue with your slides.
Great, thank you so much. And as we said, while these pre-approved plans are flexible and they can satisfy most plan sponsors' needs and objectives, the trouble lies in all these items that we were looking at. How do we balance meeting the unique needs of us as an employer or plan sponsor with the needs of the participants, and not only balancing those things, but balancing it in a way that is understandable and that we can communicate to employees. And that's a challenge. And that's why most people don't tend to look beyond those basic plan provisions. Where do we go from here? Once we have taken a look at some of these factors that have led to the decline in focus on plan provisions over time, what do we need to do in order to remedy that? Well, we've outlined a 5-step process here. And my suggestion to you all as retirement plan partners is it is a best practice to complete this process on an annual basis. So that's why when I said when we kicked off this call, I had just hopped off an annual plan review meeting. This is what I do. Well, a variation of this is what I do with the meetings. We do this on an annual basis, and who we have attend these meetings and participate in this process varies from employer to employer. So the bulk of the clients that I work with typically tend to be banks and credit unions. But over the past couple of years, my line of business has expanded, and now I have a variety of different types of employers. I have some restaurant employers. I also have some small businesses. And it's very interesting to me because I find I like to use these 3 kind of entities as an example because they all have very different needs and very different people who participate in these 5 steps that we're about to look at. For my bank and credit union and other, I would describe as large corporate America clients, they typically have well-staffed departments with delegated responsibilities, and these meetings are large and typically extend to the board level. So we may have, a payroll person, we may have the HR director, we may have, obviously, us as a vendor, any platform provider who we work with, advisor, an investment fiduciary if there's no advisor, and sometimes attorney, depending on, if we're drafting a document or if it is a specialized document or something like that. At my smaller mom and pop shops, I have, for example, a law office that has, a couple of partners. It's a very different discussion on plan design and very different attendees. We typically just have, a couple of the head honchos there and maybe one, administrative person taking notes on the call. So make sure you properly identify your audience beforehand. It really is critical because these different folks, in my experience, can have vastly different perspectives on what is appropriate for a plan and why. You know, I'm sure you would all agree that when we would include the CFO or a finance department or accounting department in these discussions, their prime considerations probably relate to budget and minimizing costs where possible. But compare that, and this is under step 1 here, right at the get-go, compare that, perhaps you'll include HR in the meeting. For any HR folks on the phone, you have very different objectives where you're looking, as we said earlier, perhaps at recruitment and retention. And through these discussions, what we do is, identify these objectives based on the various roles that people have and relationships with the plan that they have. And we then figure out what is appropriate to implement based on this step 1. But this step 1, identify plan sponsors' goals and objectives, is the absolute most important part of the process. To give an example, actually on one of the calls that I was participating in earlier, an employer had opted a couple of years ago to use an automatic contribution arrangement. Those of you who are familiar, it's the ACA, the auto enroll. But then when I was talking to them about it after the fact, they said, well, we really implemented the auto enroll just because it was kind of an industry best practice and you guys recommended it, but it wasn't really something that fits for our business needs because we have high turnover. And, I felt a little bad about that because I think, that's an example where we have to take all these considerations in hand, not just options and industry best practices, but what are our business needs? This wasn't the client I was meeting with today, but I mentioned before I have a large restaurant client. Similar to that discussion, a lot of turnover, their needs are going to be very different. So then in step 2, we pick the document format. So we said earlier that in most cases, that pre-approved document can satisfy the need. And I know in our pre-approved document, it gives us really ultimate flexibility. You can determine eligibility requirements, set the definition of salary, exclude employees, define your definition of service, state any benefits that you'd like to provide, and assign a vesting schedule. Determine whether or not you'd like to have automatic enrollment or not, and set defaults with regard to a variety of other administrative options, like are you going to allow loans? If so, how many? What interest rate? When can people take a distribution? What frequency can they do it on? And are there any age requirements for in-service or hardship distributions? That can all fit into that pre-approved document in so many different ways. But cases where I've seen we need an additional or other document include things like, as I mentioned earlier, your ESOPs. Typically, your KSOPs might need a different document format. Additionally, if you are perhaps on an individually designed defined benefit plan or a combination plan, sometimes plans, for example, floor offset plans, will provide a base level of benefit in one plan to be supplemented if necessary in a different plan if that base level of benefit is not reached or met. Those types of scenarios cannot fit into the pre-approved document. But that doesn't mean they're not worth offering. As I mentioned before, in the case, for example, of the ESOPs and the KSOPs, those provide great opportunities to help employees feel like they have some skin in the game. Also, as we said, provide for succession planning and things of that nature. So while most of us can fit into pre-approved, and it is probably the simplest, there are other options available, although those individually designed documents will probably need to be drafted and maintained by an outside attorney. Oh, I didn't mention this, but another consideration just along the lines of upsides and downsides of document format, I would say in my experience to maintain a pre-approved document is probably less expensive than an individually designed document. Reason being, like we said before, those pre-approved are a little bit more like the check the box, whereas the individually designed is actually going to need to be written by an attorney and maintained. So anytime you wanted to amend an individually designed document, it's a little bit of a bigger process than it would be if you just used a standard document with whatever vendor you have. Then step 3 is understanding those plan design options. So I alluded to this before. Under step 2, I gave you all the things that can be included in the volume submitter document. So step 3 is understanding all that stuff. So take number 1, what's important to you, what are you allowed to do, and what do you want to choose from that list. We'll talk more about step 3 in just a couple moments, and as I said, I'll show you some examples. And then step 4, make your choice. Select your design options that fulfill your goals and objectives. And step 5, reevaluate. So that's what I was doing today. We were on the step 5 of things, where we have our annual meeting. We review the plan provisions, either that full adoption agreement or the summary checklist I mentioned. And then we talk about how things have been going with the employer for the last year or so. We discuss whether or not their business needs have changed. We talk about best practices in the industry. For example, today, I recommended a voluntary savings increase provision. This was a larger employer who has a good bit of turnover, would really like people to start contributing more, but is really highly cognizant of the fact, being a large restaurant employer, that, cost of living has been an issue this year. They have auto enrollments already and might want to add in auto escalation, but they're concerned about the optics of that with their employees. Maybe if you're already living paycheck to paycheck, you might not like the idea of having your contribution upped next year and the year after. So we recommended the voluntary auto escalation option, which is available with most administrators, to ease employees into this process of, escalating year after year. So step 5, reevaluate, is equally as important as step 1, because if we hadn't had this discussion today, we'd just be sweeping people into the plan at, a 3% contribution rate automatically, and most of them are not coming back to reevaluate either. So today, we did it for them. All right, so I said that I was going to give you some examples of plan design and what works when, and that's what we're looking at on this chart. So we've got goals and objectives on the left-hand side, and we've got some examples of effective plan design or what we might do to achieve those objectives on the right. Contribution and deduction, augmentation and redirection. So here, we want certain employees or groups of employees to receive additional contributions. And I'm going to give examples of this, but I also want to talk about item 2 on this list, because I think that some of the examples are somewhat similar for the second one as well, which is additional contributions and deferral opportunities. So in this case, that would be like if you are an advisor meeting with a plan sponsor and the plan sponsor said something like, I want my HCEs to be able to contribute as much as they want, and right now they can't. So there are a variety of ways that we can satisfy these first 2 goals. Under item 1, if we want certain employees or groups of employees to get additional contributions, we can do that either through the way we design our match or through the way we design our eligibility or our plan exclusions. Let me explain. Maybe you have a change in benefit program. I've seen some employers that have an old DB plan, that's a pension plan, that they really want to get rid of because it's just, interest rates are rising and it's a good time to terminate plans, but you don't want to leave employees with no benefits or reduced benefits. Or maybe you're freezing a pension plan and you need to make up benefits on the 401k side for people. That's a great example of where you can have certain employees or groups of employees receive additional contributions. I've seen plans that say effective for employees hired before such and such a date or on and after such and such a date, this type of additional match will apply. So that's one way. You can do it based on date of hire. But I said earlier, you can also do it based on, eligibility and things like that. Maybe you give a very generous profit sharing plan, but you don't want new employees to get that profit sharing plan. maybe in that case, you have a dual eligibility provision that allows employees to come into the plan to contribute their own dollars immediately, but makes them wait, say, a year in order to receive that very generous profit sharing contribution. So that's one way that you can make employees wait a little bit to receive the benefit of that. And that's one area we kicked off this by saying plan design is a lost art. For the plans that come across my desk that are new to me, I typically don't see that feature, and I think it's really useful. So just to reiterate that, that's the idea of dual eligibility, which is saying one set of eligibility requirements applies to contributing my money into the plan, and another set of eligibility requirements applies to contributing or to receiving employer contributions. That doesn't hurt you from necessarily so much from a recruitment and retention perspective, because you still allow employees to get saving right away. But from a budget and just a philosophical perspective, they wouldn't get any benefits from you in that first year if you didn't want them to. So I don't see that one used as much as I think it could be. And I think the reason is because I think employers don't always understand the idea of monitoring for those two eligibility periods. So any plan partners on this call, that in my mind, like I said, from the plans that cross my desk, it's kind of just a low-hanging fruit thing that I always look at to see if we can help them out with it all. The second one, I said it's similar, but I'm actually going to give a different example for that one. So here we want a specific group to maximize their employee deferrals, and that's HCEs, highly compensated employees. And you might be thinking, well, Kate, no, we can't do that. I already know, I know the compliance rule. That's why I get refunds. HCEs can't contribute too much to the plan. And that's true, but you can use, for example, the timing and the date stuff that we talked about in the first example, or you could even do, for example, a profit sharing contribution that uses permitted disparity. And this is something else that I don't see as often as I think it might be applicable. And again, I think it's just tied to that overarching idea of, overall simplification. I think I don't see permitted disparity because it's more complicated for employers and vendors, not so much necessarily the employees, because what permitted disparity allows you to do is make a disproportionately larger contribution to HCEs than you would to NHCEs, non-highly compensated employees, and it's perfectly within the Internal Revenue Code regulations. And the reason, the sort of philosophy behind permitted disparity is tied in with Social Security. The idea behind Social Security is an inverse income replacement ratio, meaning that the greater your salary prior to retirement, the less you will receive of that as a percentage of that salary in retirement from Social Security benefits. But lower earners, by contrast, actually receive a disproportionately larger share expressed as a percentage of their salary and Social Security benefits than higher earners. So Social Security has a disparity built into it that disproportionately benefits lower earners. What permitted disparity in retirement plans does is attempt to close that gap. I typically used to see it more commonly in the old defined benefit plans that I used to work with, and then when they, got frozen or terminated, those plan design features just kind of went away. But they're really useful if you do have a group of HCEs that you want to disproportionately benefit. And this too is built into most pre-approved plan documents as well. I know it certainly is ours. All right. Another goal and objective could be eliminate compliance test failure and contribution or deferral limitations. So the sponsor wants to avoid distributions to correct excesses. Let's talk about this. So we know that if we have a non-safe harbor plan, that we are subject to annual compliance testing. And that includes the ADP ACP testing, among some others, but the ADP ACP testing typically tends to be, I think, what we're referring to here when we see test failures and refunds. And what happens there with those two tests is that there are a couple of different criteria. Basically, I'll give you some examples in just a couple of minutes that say that HCEs are allowed to contribute on average out of their paycheck more than NHCEs. just, in acknowledgement of the fact that they probably have more income to do so, but not so much more as to be deemed discriminatory. And now that amount depends on how much NHCEs are contributing. So it actually can change every year based on how much your non-highly compensated employees contribute. So you might not necessarily know from year to year how much you can contribute or if you are going to get a refund or not. Now, there are quite a few ways around this that I think are really interesting and worth considering if this is a problem for you. The first example, and the easiest example, is to simply adopt a safe harbor plan. So I said several times we'll talk about safe harbor plans. Let's do it now. A safe harbor plan is a special plan design type that says, I, as the employer, am going to agree to notify employees of my contribution to them, to make a contribution to them of a certain type predefined by the IRS, and to provide a certain vesting schedule for them. And it's very strict. In exchange for satisfying those requirements, the IRS says, good job, now you are exempt from this pesky little ADP ACP test that may be causing your refunds every year. So safe harbor is the easy way to eliminate this issue, but it also is the most restrictive way. There are other ways that I personally have used to eliminate this issue, and one of them is tied in with non-highly compensated employees. So I said just a moment ago that the limit for how much your highly comped people can put in changes every year just by the nature of the calculation because it's contingent on the non-highly's average. So, if you're a math nerd like I am, you're probably following this logic and thinking, well, there's more than one way to do this. What if we just boosted the average of the non-highlies? That solves the problem in a different way without having to go to that, restrictive length of adopting the safe harbor plan. And I have used this as a method, and it works. And one way that you can accomplish it, there's no specific provision, make my NHCEs contribute more in the adoption agreement, but what there is are those auto-enrollment features. I have used auto-enrollment in the case of large employers with high turnover to bring people into the plan who might not otherwise make an election at a contribution rate that is sufficient enough to avoid these highly compensated employees getting refunds. And it has the secondary benefit of, well, now all of a sudden your non-highlies who wouldn't otherwise save are saving and actually have retirement balances that they wouldn't otherwise have. But this discussion is so nuanced, so I want to share one example of where this has gone wrong for me, because I'm sure if anybody listening, if you've been in this industry for any length of time, you can have the best of intentions and think you understand this material so well, but we don't know what we don't know. So these auto rules came out a couple of years ago. Well, a couple. It's probably over a decade now, but in my world, a couple of years. So when these rules all first came out, I wasn't incredibly familiar with them yet, but I knew that they existed out there. And I had an employer who was getting refunds, and it was really upsetting them. So I said, hey, let's try this auto. And they said, okay, great, but we don't really want our employees to be forced to contribute too much. So they set it up at 1% automatic enrollment. And it was when auto enrollment, like I said, had first come out. I don't think we did as good of a job from a marketing perspective as we should have at communicating it. So it was received poorly from an optics perspective. And to add insult to injury, because the ACA or auto enrollment amount was so low at 1%, which is what the employer wanted, again, they didn't want to force people into anything, it didn't even do anything to change the testing results, and the HCEs still ended up getting refunds. So just make sure anytime you make these strategic plan design changes that you approach them from all angles. And I hope you learned from my mistake, because I think I said two important takeaways here. Number one, I talked about people that you want to include in these plan design meetings before, but I didn't mention the marketing team specifically because I wanted to talk about it here. Include your marketing folks in because they can help you deliver these messages. And number two, make sure that any compliance representatives that you work with, especially on topics like this, are looped in, because they can help you, run projections and stuff like that using various assumptions. And I think had I done that, I probably would have avoided the heartache that occurred in my own situation. So learn from my mistakes. And then we have cost containment. There's lots of ways that we can control or limit the cost of plan. We can reduce our benefits. We can add or increase our vesting schedule, add the dual eligibility that we already referenced, where we wait until we receive those employer benefits. We can exclude certain employees, and we'll talk about that over the next couple slides. So lots of different options there. Recruitment, how do we plan to attract and retain? And I think we discussed a lot of that as well, specifically with regard to those eligibility requirements. I mentioned dual eligibility several times now, which is having those two sets of requirements. On the flip side, what I frequently see when people haven't looked at plan design in a dog's age and just don't give it much mind and don't have dual eligibility, I frequently see 1 year of service for both employer and employee contributions, and that's not doing you any favors at all from a recruitment perspective. So you may want to consider dropping that down. Additionally, with regard to rollovers, if you need to have eligibility requirements for some reason, for example, a lot of times I see a 3-month eligibility requirement because it ties in with eligibility for medical and other benefits. If you do it for some kind of reason, set up your rollovers so that people do not need to meet the eligibility requirements for the plan first before rolling into the plan. Because some of your new employees, even if they have to wait 3 months, they might want to roll that money. They might have to roll that money. So give them that option. And again, that's something else that, even that would still be in that, in most pre-approved documents. So that document, as we said, really does give you lots of flexibility. And then lastly, simplification. You want to streamline administrative process and reduce the staff time needed to support the plan. Now, this is kind of the opposite idea of some of the other things we've spoken about. So this might be a reason to adopt that safe harbor plan. I have employers who they just do not like the annual testing. They have a hard time understanding it. It's yet another data request. You got to get salary information. I'm sure you all know if you've been part of this process. Safe harbor gets rid of that. So, that's the biggest, one of the biggest reasons in my mind to adopt that. All right. So those were the goals and objectives that we've laid out. There might be additional goals and objectives that we haven't listed here. So what I would encourage you to do is look through this list of questions, and if you're not already asking these either for yourself as an employee of a plan sponsor or a partner to a plan, whether in that advisory, legal, compliance, administrative, whatever role you may be in, think about these questions. So what do you want the plan to do? It's so obvious, but it's more than just be a retirement plan, as we saw with all those other examples. Would you change anything about your plan if you could? In a perfect world scenario. Do you have specific needs, or I should say, does your accounting department or your client's accounting department have specific tax needs? That's another reason to keep those folks in the discussion. Do not exclude them. Do you want employees to contribute on their own, or just you as the employer, or as your partner if you're an advisor or legal firm? It used to be that the answer was no, but that has changed almost unequivocally to yes these days. Do we want to include or exclude certain employees? We have the ability to do that, and we didn't talk about that too much yet, but I'm going to circle back to that for the sake of time because we have some examples illustrating that, and we have to get to our poll question. Is compliance testing a problem? We talked about that. And are your employees savvy investors, which is also critical from that investment discussion viewpoint. Pick your document format. The volume submitter, the pre-approved document, we said it's super flexible. Make sure you've got those right provisions from the get-go. Make sure you dive into that adoption agreement, meet with your document vendors and plan providers, and really talk about these pros and cons and your notes from this presentation in your annual plan review meetings. Or if you are a vendor yourself, consider these topics for your next plan review agenda. Understand the options. We, again, already discussed what is available in that pre-approved. Make sure that the goals and objectives selected in that document align with the goals and objectives of the employer. I already mentioned the second bullet point in that example of my failed automatic enrollment experience. Make sure you understand those compliance testing outcomes because it very much matters. And I didn't mention this already, but I talked about the group testing, which is the ADP, ACP testing, which is typically why people adopt those safe harbor plans. But I'm sure you know we've also got the individual testing. So that's the 415 limit, 401A17 comp limit. In other words, the IRS says there are certain limits that you as an individual can't exceed with regard to the amount of compensation that is considered for retirement plan purposes or the amount that you can contribute each year. So your vendors will test for that as well, and most documents have options to apply different limits if you wanted to have lower limits, although I don't see that too often. And select the options that fulfill your goals and objectives. Make sure you follow the document, though. Once you select those options, to give a different example, I have so many experiences with automatic enrollment. It's one of our newer, regulatory speaking, really major kind of changes to 401k plans. And it's been widely adopted in my experience, but it has had bumps along the road. So, for example, I've had people adopt auto plans and not understand escalation provisions. And it is so important. And this case that's here, the Firestone and Rubber Co. Case, is a great example of this. That this was so the Firestone, the tire company. It was a termination severance plan, but it was covered under ERISA, so it was subject to all these terms and conditions from a regulatory perspective. They sold a piece of their business to another company, and when that happened, the employees wanted to take their benefits, but were not able to because it was not deemed to be a termination in service. It was just a acquisition. And as a result, they couldn't access this money, so they filed this court case. But the court affirmed, actually, that Firestone was in the right. They followed the terms of the plan document. And while certainly some cases an acquisition is a distributable event, in this case it was not. It was a small piece of business. It wasn't a partial plan termination or anything along those lines. And unfortunately, those folks lost the case and were not entitled to their benefits. But that's why it's so important not only to understand these provisions ourselves, but to convey them to our employees, because that's critical as well. All right, we've come to our next polling question at this point. So what is the first step in that plan design process? Understand the options, pick the document format, ID goals and objectives, or select design options.
The poll will be up for about another 15 seconds or so for anyone who hasn't selected an answer yet. The poll is now closed. The correct answer was C, identify the plan sponsor's goals and objectives. Kate, you may continue.
Great. And I do think I need to time check myself here because I have 2:48 by my clock. We've got 12 minutes left. So I think what I'll do, we have a variety of examples of everything we've spoken about. I'll show you some of my favorite examples for the next, say, 6 minutes or so. And then I want to make sure we save 2 to 3 minutes for our last poll question because you need that for your CE. And then we'll leave a minute or two at the end for any questions. This is step 5, reevaluate. We talked about amending the plan. Just make sure you have a board resolution if necessary, the document. If there is an SMM or an updated SPD, make sure you distribute that. So that ties in with that court case we said before, just, that communication is so important. All right, so here's these examples that I was talking about. So let's look. I like this one. This is an example of the safe harbor plan. So I beat up safe harbor plans in this presentation, but I don't mean to. I really do think that they have a tremendous amount of benefit, specifically to your NHCEs, because it guarantees them some sort of employer contribution, whether it be a non-elective contribution or a match if they contribute. And I just think that that's really important in a world where, so many of us are just not saving. Plus, it allows your HCEs to defer as much as they want. So let's look at this example here. So say we've got a couple NHCEs here who are not contributing at all. They can't afford it right now. We have one who's doing 2% and one who's doing 6%. Remember how I said the limit is floating based on what these guys are doing? Well, I already did the calculation, but this HCE can only contribute 4% under the current plan design. But if they adopt a safe harbor, the ADP test is deemed satisfied and they can contribute up to that annual additions limit, even if they wanted to. So that's, definitely a reason, if you have the budget for it, because that matters, because you are required to make a contribution, I think it can be a very good idea. I think I already discussed the pros and cons of why you might want to do this. Expense being the downside, but simplification being one of the upsides. We'll look at another profile here. So what would we do if we wanted to make matching contributions for certain employee groups to encourage retention and support recruiting? Well, we could do it a couple of different ways. We could use the plan document that permits multiple benefit structures. So this is just to kind of round up and tie up everything we said before. Employees hired before or after such and such a date. Permitted disparity in your profit sharing formula. You could do changes in eligibility. You could exclude certain people or include certain people. You could exclude maybe hourly paid employees if they were, less integral to your long-term strategic plan than perhaps your salaried employees, and that would be a cost savings to you as well. So inclusions and exclusions do allow us to augment match for certain employees, as does our match design in general. I'll give you an example here. Let's say we have 50% on 6 for everybody. We've got a lot of turnover, though, in one department, and it has a lot of NHCEs in it, and we want to target them. So we amend the plan to give NHCEs a dollar-for-dollar match up to 10% of comp. And now we have more than one formula, but a separate, more generous formula for HCEs. You can't give NHCEs less than HCEs, but we're not doing that here. We're giving them more. So we have 2 formulas, satisfy their tests, and we're all good then. Then our HCEs can contribute as much as they want, and we get our NHCEs having more, and we're working on that recruitment and retention. And one more thing about this, just from a budget perspective, you might be thinking, but Kate, no, I do not have the budget to give a dollar-for-dollar match up to 10% to all my, design NHCEs. Well, the thing that I love about a stretch match is it might cost more because you might have some really motivated people, but you're probably not going to have everybody contributing up to that 10. So it's a great goal for people, and it typically doesn't have the implication of all of these people contributing 10% on day one because most typically can't afford it, but it encourages people to keep going, which is so important for that recruitment and retention. We have 253 here, so I'm going to go to our third poll question just to make sure we have time for it, so that you can get your CE. And then there's a service crediting example that I'll go back to if we have time. So this is tied in with one of the ones we just looked at. Which plan design option allows HCEs to defer more into the plan without testing? A, a safe harbor plan. B, a plan with employer contributions. C, a plan that allows for in-service distributions. Or D, a plan with matching contributions.
The poll will be live for about another 15 seconds or so for anyone who has not selected a response. The poll is now closed, and the correct answer was A, a safe harbor plan. Kate, you may continue.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, great. Now that we've satisfied our CE requirement from the polling perspective, let's go back to one of my favorite topics. Yes, as I said, I'm a nerd. Where is it? Service crediting. We did not talk about this, but there are two ways that you can measure service in these retirement plans. You can do counting hours, or sometimes called 1,000 hours, or elapsed time. So elapsed time is what we're talking about here in this example. Elapsed time is also called the equivalency method. And what happens here is, excuse me, I said the wrong thing. We're using the counting hours method. But let's talk about the elapsed time method first, and then we'll look at the example. Elapsed time is saying from date of hire to date of termination. We're going to just give you service for that whole kit and caboodle of time. If you terminate at any point in there, if you come back during that same 12-month period, uninterrupted service. So it's not looking at any hours, it's not looking at when you came to work or anything like that. One reason why I like elapsed time is because it is a lot easier. If you have a strapped, resource-strapped HR department, it makes sense, a lot of sense. But on the flip side, if budget constraints are more important than resources, and this is why, have all these parties involved because you want to weigh these components, you might want to adopt accounting hours or equivalency method plan, which is what we're seeing here. This says that you need to have 1,000 hours in order to receive service credit for the year. If you don't have 1,000 hours, you don't get service credit, which means you don't get a benefit. And what this naturally lets you do is exclude those employees who are part-time, seasonal, college help, whatever it may be, that, as we said, if budget is a consideration, this might be a better option. So this is also considered to be plan design, and it does impact who gets what, but it doesn't directly impact the actual benefit formula. Rather, how do we measure somebody's employee experience to determine whether or not they get that benefit or not? So it's really interesting when we look at this, because there are just so many ways that we can get at our goals in these plans. Are you going to attack your goal from the perspective of budget, recruitment and retention, benefits for a certain employee group, whether it be HCEs, NHCEs, a different type of group, or some combination of all of those? And as we said, there really is an opportunity here right now, because plan design has been absolutely de-emphasized over the last 10 or more years for all the reasons that we spoke about earlier. So this makes that opportunity. So, you can create a process using these steps, these 5 steps that we looked at today, that really facilitates these, not only the plan design review, but really allows your plan sponsors and partners to accomplish their objectives in a way that is actually meaningful, actionable, and that can successfully be translated to your employee population. So with that, Lizzie, I'll turn it over to you for any concluding remarks, or if we got any questions in the chat box over the last hour.
So we do have one question, Kate, where somebody asked, do terminated participants fit into the discussion of plan design?
Oh, that is such a great one, because this whole time we've been talking about active people and how you manage their benefits and things like that. But yeah, you do have certain force out options for your terminated participants. The IRS says that by default we can cash out people with balances under $1,000. And what that does is, especially, for example, if you're on the cusp of being a large plan filer, that 5,500 audit is not cheap. So forcing people out of the plan can help keep your counts down below that level. That typically is built into most of these, especially the pre-approved documents. But with you do have other options to, for example, roll balances in between a certain level, which is $1,000 and $5,000. You could roll those automatically to an IRA. So that is not always a default election, but is something that's available in those pre-approved documents that you could toggle, which, if you were nearing that large plan filer status and concerned about the budget implications potentially of an audit, I would definitely recommend looking to make sure that you have a provision to roll balances for terminated employees between $1,000 and $5,000 to an outside IRA to prevent you from hitting that audit requirement. I hope that answer was helpful.
Great. So it looks like we are at the top of the hour. So I'd just like to say thank you, Kate, and everyone who attended today's webinar. Any questions we did not get to today, we will follow up with you separately. And just as a reminder, please complete the survey questions that will pop up on your screen in just a minute. And everyone have a great rest of your day.